And now on the line is Tinsley, the head of Advocacy at Barnardos Ireland. June, welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, June, the main reason we are doing this interview today is to try to publicise more what Barnardos are calling for in the budget in the Dáil next week. Before we talk about that, there are at least 3 other big stories in the news this week that I would like to get your opinion of. First of all, your CEO, Fergus Finlay, retired a couple of days ago. Do you want to just say something about Fergus retiring?
Yeah, no, it's a big change for Barnardos. He's been with us for 13 years. So to have him to retire on Wednesday is a shock that we're all trying to adjust to. Obviously, having our new CEO, Suzanne Connolly, someone who's coming from within the organisation, it's a great thing because she knows so much about the organisation. However, Fergus is such a figurehead that certainly his leadership will be missed as we adjust into a new regime under Suzanne. So, it's a time of change for Barnardos.
I've never met Fergus, but I've come across him often in the media, both as CEO of Barnardos and in other capacities, you know. So maybe at some other stage in the future I'd like to get round to interviewing him. The second big story in the news this week, before we talk about the budget, is the Raise the Roof demonstration that was held on Wednesday. Barnardos supported that demonstration, didn't you?
Yes, we were down there, along with, it was great to see the huge turnout. There was about 10,000 people there, is what they estimate. And what was great about it is the fact that it was such a sign of solidarity, because it was a mixture of young, old, from Dublin, from outside Dublin, from traveller backgrounds to people with disabilities to it was such a cross section of so many people, which really showed to us how much the housing and homeless crisis is affecting absolutely everybody in Ireland. And yes, it's an absolute tragedy that there are 10,000 people who do not have a place to call home, and that doesn't include all those individuals who are caught up in the net of experiencing either hidden homelessness or are trapped in direct provision and can't move out even though they might have leave to remain status, or a family who is stuck in a women's refuge having experienced domestic violence and can't get out because there's no homes to go to, no rented accommodation that they can source. So I think, and obviously students as well, not being able to secure appropriate accommodation for while they are attending a college. So it was a very telling rally that this is essentially the biggest social problem of our generation at the minute.
Lastly, before we talk a bit about the budget in the Dáil next week, the Public Health Alcohol Bill passed through the Dáil on Wednesday night. I believe you are big supporters of this legislation also, were you?
Yes, we've been campaigning along with many others in seeking the passage of this bill, which took the guts of 3 years to get through, and it's great to see that it's finally passed through all stages of the Dáil. It has to go back to the Seanad for kind of rubber stamping before it's signed into law. But I suppose the reason why Barnardos was a strong advocate for this piece of legislation is that it's taking a very much a public health perspective to trying to tackle alcoholism, and that means inserting minimum pricing on alcohol products. It means having a watershed in relation to the times of advertising, so it minimises the exposure to children. It means putting labels on alcohol products so that consumers are informed of all the health risks when drinking alcohol. And I suppose it just is a significant milestone in that it's facing Ireland's alcohol addiction issues face on and from a public health perspective. And I believe that is a positive thing, and I certainly believe it'll benefit children in the long run.
Yeah, it's one of the biggest pieces of legislation ever to go through the Oireachtas. I think it's brilliant news that it's going to be passed through the Oireachtas soon, you know. To talk a bit about the budget next week, can you tell me what you in Barnardos are calling for?
Well, I suppose we're calling on it really that the budget will prioritise children. And I know we say this time and time again, but I think the reality is that the economy is very buoyant at the minute. We know unemployment is down, which is all very positive. And yet there's 1 in 9 children living in consistent poverty right across the country. And we don't feel that is acceptable. And these children's childhoods are lost because of poverty, because of homelessness, because of neglect, because of languishing on waiting lists to get access to much needed health services, or the cost of education is meaning that they have to drop out of school early. And really we're calling on the government to take a stand on this and to invest in key public services that would demonstrate to us that they are prioritising children and will then honour their own commitment to lift 100,000 children out of consistent poverty by 2020.
One policy I know I talked to you about this a couple of times over the last few years that I'm really interested in, because I think it'll make such a huge difference, is the policy you actually brought in about free education, so that school uniforms and school books are free. You know what I mean? Do you want to say something about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's a kind of a cornerstone of some of the recommendations we put forward for this year. And you're right, it's to call on the government to honour the fact that we, in the Irish Constitution, have free primary education, and yet year on year we know parents are put to the pin of their collar to try and afford all the back to school costs that a child needs to start school in September. And we believe that education is a fundamental right. It's proven time and time again, if you want to break the cycle of poverty, invest in education, because that's the tools that a child will need to break out of education. And yet the cost is a barrier for many people. We believe that all the things a child needs to complete the curriculum should be provided by the state, similar to what happens in many other countries. So that means things like books, stationery, classroom resources, that there should be no call for voluntary contributions on parents. We haven't gone down the road of the uniforms really, because they're dictated to and made up by the Board of Management, so it's very much at a local level. And you don't necessarily need a uniform to complete the curriculum. So I suppose we've costed our proposal, and it works out at 103 million extra that will be required from the Department of Education to provide a genuinely free primary education system. And we know that doesn't have to happen all in one go. So we're kind of saying, well, why don't we do it incrementally? And even in this year's budget, if they committed 20 million, that alone would provide all free school books and workbooks for primary school children, which would ensure a very level playing field for all children and would genuinely save hundreds of euros for parents.
It makes such a big difference if those policies are brought in, you know what I mean? And they're not a huge amount of money if you look at the grand scheme of things for the budget overall. Are there any other policies, any other big policies you want to mention about your recommendations for the budget?
Sure. I mean, in the area of health, for example, we certainly would want a clear investment that the government wants to advance this Launch a Care report, because that is a cross-department or a cross-governmental report. It's a roadmap for moving towards better public provision of healthcare. And at the minute, we know that access to healthcare is often based on what you can buy and of what you can afford, rather than based on what your health need is. And we believe that there should be greater investment, particularly in kind of community settings, so that children get access to speech and language therapists when they need it, or psychologists, social workers, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, all those kind of core professionals that are should be available in the community, so that if a healthcare issue arises, a child can get access to it as quick as possible for free of charge. We know childhood is so time limited, so any developmental issues or medical issues that are cropping up, they need to be addressed as soon as possible in order to make sure the condition doesn't worsen.
Have you met with the Minister for Finance and other ministers, like Minister for Education and Minister for Health, over the last year about the budget? Because I'm just asking because I want to know if there's kind of any indication as to whether there would be any good news in any of the measures you were calling for next week.
We have met with some of the ministers directly, and if we didn't meet with some of them directly, we've met with their advisors. And so I suppose that they're very aware of what Barnardos' requests and recommendations are. As to whether I'm hopeful next week whether some of these will be delivered on, I suppose it's too early to tell. I'm not overly hopeful in the area of education. I think that if anything they could increase the capitation rates in all schools, which if they did that I think is a very positive thing. But I would like to see if that happens and the school system has a bit more of the funding that they need to deliver the school, then it should see a reduction in the request for voluntary contributions asked for by parents. And only when we do our survey next year will we be able to see if there's a link in that, and I hope there would be. In terms of childcare, we know that the Minister for Children, Catherine Savone, is a very keen advocate of investing in childcare services in order to make them more affordable for parents and of better quality. So I'm hopeful that there will be a significant investment in the area of childcare next week.